Hi, welcome to my channel. Today's video is going to be book recommendations for if you are looking for a book to just destroy you or absolutely break your heart. So the books I'm going to share today are just some of the saddest books I have ever read. I personally love sad books. I feel like those are always the ones that are super impactful and just really stick with me. And some of these books, while they are some of the saddest books I've ever read, they're also some of my absolute favorite books of all time. So if you're like me and you like to purposely break your heart with books, then these are the perfect books to read. I do want to give a quick side note to definitely check trigger warnings with all of these books, since they are obviously very sad, heartbreaking books. They do deal with very heavy and sensitive content, so definitely make sure you check any trigger warnings or content warnings before starting any of these books if you need to. So the first book I'm going to recommend is If He Had Been With Me by Laura Nallen. So this one is a young adult book. Most of these books are going to be adult books, but this one is YA. And this book, I found out about it on TikTok and I decided to read it because, like I said, I was specifically wanting a book that I knew was going to break my heart and kind of leave me thinking about it afterwards. And this book just absolutely destroyed me, way more than I was expecting. I knew it was going to be heartbreaking going into it, just obviously based on what I heard, based on the title and the synopsis. I kind of had an idea of what to expect, but even then I was just not prepared for this book at all. It was so shocking, the things that happened in it. And in this book there was one scene specifically that I just found difficult to read just because of the content and the topic that it dealt with. It was something that I had a hard time reading because it was just so heartbreaking. I did just want to give that warning because I, for the most part, can get through heartbreaking books. Yes, I'll cry and be obviously sad while I'm reading it, but this book was just one that was a little bit difficult at times for me to get through just because of what it dealt with. But the storyline of this book is basically these two childhood best friends. They were really close when they were young, and then kind of in middle school they started to drift apart, and at this point they're in high school and they pretty much are just in two separate groups. They don't really interact much, but they are next door neighbors and their moms are best friends, so that's kind of how they know each other. So they still are forced to kind of see each other and interact during the holidays or when their moms will come over to the other's house. But basically at this point they're not really close anymore, and they do kind of get closer towards the end of the book. They kind of reconnect. I don't really want to go too much more in depth than that because I don't want to give anything away, but this book is just super heartbreaking. It's one that I still think about just because I was just not prepared at all for what happens in this book. And just based on the synopsis, obviously my synopsis was very vague, but if you look up the book and read that synopsis, you will probably get a better idea of what it's about and what happens. I will say that this book is pretty slow. While I was reading it, I didn't necessarily enjoy it that much just because it was very slow. Time was passing very slowly. I feel maybe that's kind of the point in the book. And for the most part, I just wasn't enjoying it until I got to the end, and just once it was over, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And that's just why I loved it so much, because it's just one of those books that really stuck with me. But yeah, I highly recommend it. Like I said, it is a young adult book, and definitely check trigger warnings if you need to. So the next book I want to recommend is A Thousand Boy Kisses by Tilly Cole. This one is another young adult book. These are the only two young adult books that I will be recommending in this video. The rest of them are new adult or adult fiction. So for this book, I was really hesitant to read it just because it is a young adult book, and I kind of saw people recommending it and mentioning that's a young adult book and kind of giving age recommendations for it. So I didn't really know if I wanted to read it because I just wasn't interested in reading a book that was for younger children, because that's what I thought it was. It is a young adult book, but I think definitely more for kind of teenagers or older teenagers. But the way people talked about it, I thought it was more a middle school age book, and it's definitely not. I would definitely say high school age is most appropriate for this book. But I finally decided to give it a chance because, like I said, I love heartbreaking books, so I was specifically looking for a heartbreaking book, so I picked up this one. But it basically follows these childhood best friends, Poppy and Rune. They met when they were 5 years old, I think, and they pretty much were best friends. They eventually fell in love by the age of 15. They're already dating and they're just completely in love with each other. But then Rune's family has to move to Norway for a couple years, so obviously he has to go with them. And him and Poppy do plan to keep in contact during that time, but she basically just cuts him off out of nowhere and they don't speak to each other for the 2 years that he's gone. And so when he comes back, he's kind of a different person now, and they're not really friends anymore, obviously, but eventually they do reconnect and Rune finds out why Poppy cut him off 2 years ago. But the thing about this book is it was just one of those books that I could not stop thinking about. I pretty much cried throughout a lot of it, but specifically in the end, once I finished it and closed the book, I just sat there and cried and processed what this book was, and it kind of went in a direction that I just wasn't expecting, but I still really loved it, and it just made me think at the end, and it just left me in tears. Like I said, I literally just sat there and cried after I was done because it was just very heartbreaking, but it was also just like a really beautiful love story too. So the next book I want to recommend is Forever Interrupted by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this book basically follows this girl named Elsie who meets this guy named Ben on New Year's Day, and they pretty much have like a connection right away. They go on a date very soon after that, and they fall in love with each other really quickly, and then by May of that year they end up eloping. But then 9 days after they've gotten married, he is killed in a car accident, and of course Elsie is completely heartbroken. And the book after that is basically just the aftermath of that and her just kind of like going through the grieving of losing her husband. But the story is told by like switching from then and now, so like every other chapter it is like a flashback and then it goes to like the present day. But I just thought the story was great. It shows a lot of just like scenarios and like kind of what grieving for someone is like, and by the end you kind of see an understanding among the characters of what it is like to kind of like experience a really great love like that, and how really like you learn that there's no timelines and stuff like that, and it really doesn't matter like how long she knew him or how long she got to be with him. But I just really loved it. Obviously it's not necessarily like a happy ending because he does die like right in the beginning and you just kind of get like flashbacks, but even then I still really loved like seeing those flashbacks and seeing these characters and like the way he loved her, and it just made it so much more sad because like you get to see like their relationship and how like happy and in love they were, but you already know that they like don't get to have that happy ending together. But this book is just one that has really stuck with me. I cried so much while reading this. I think when I was reading this book that was the most I had ever cried while reading a book, especially because it does switch from like the then and now, so like every other chapter pretty much I was like crying, and it was just really heartbreaking because like I said you get to see like the cute moments of their relationship and then it switches to like the present day where he's obviously no longer with her. But this book, when I first heard about it, I wasn't sure if I would like it. I did eventually give it a chance because it's by Taylor Jenkins Reid and she is one of my favorite authors, and even though it's extremely heartbreaking, it's so worth reading. It's such a great book. I highly recommend this one. So the next book I'm going to recommend is actually part of a series. This is book 2 in the Ravenhood series by Kate Stewart, and that is Exodus. So I did do a review of this whole series, but I just loved it so much. It was an amazing series. It's definitely one of my all-time favorites. But book 2 specifically in this series was just so heartbreaking. It is a 3-book series and the books do all follow each other, so you do have to read the first one before you read this one. But I'm not going to go too in depth into what it's about because I really can't explain it without you knowing what the first book is about. And even then I feel like these books you just kind of need to go in like knowing nothing about it. But I highly recommend this series. The first book was really great. I loved it, and then this one was just amazing too. And the thing about this book was I thought I was prepared for what happened. I didn't directly have this book spoiled for me, but based on like what I saw about it, mostly like on TikTok, I had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen, and I was correct in that. But I didn't expect it to like continue to be heartbreaking because there is like this certain part of the book that is just very heartbreaking. I definitely cried on that part, and I thought that was it. Like I thought the heartbreak just ended there, like we were just gonna have that scene, but it wasn't. It continued to be heartbreaking like throughout the rest of the book. There was just a lot of like really like sad scenes that come up. This book is like a suspenseful romance, and I really don't know what else to say without like giving anything away, but it does follow this girl named Cecilia, and she moves to like this small town and she meets this guy named Sean, and she kind of like gets introduced to like his friends and like his kind of group of people that he hangs out with, and there's just kind of like a lot of secrets within this group of people, and it's just not really what you would expect, I guess. And that's kind of the first book, and so the second book is like a follow-up to that, but like I said, I really can't say much or give anything away because these books are like meant to just like be read like without knowing anything about them. So all the rest of the books I'm going to recommend are all by the same author, and that author is Colleen Hoover. I would say she's like the go-to person for books that will like absolutely destroy you, so I'm just going to be sharing a few of them. So the first book I'm going to recommend is Hopeless. So this book follows this girl named Sky, and she is going to public school for the first time, and she meets this guy named Holder, and eventually they do kind of start to obviously like interact with each other, and they kind of like have this connection between them, and they eventually end up in a relationship together. But at one point Holder kind of starts to act a little bit different around her, and he starts to kind of like distance himself from her a little bit, and of course she like notices that, and he kind of seems to be like keeping some sort of secrets from her, but she does start to find out some things, and it's just a very heartbreaking book like all of these are. But this one is another one of those books that I had like a difficult time reading through some of this stuff just because of the topics that did come up in this book. And I know like me saying that is pretty vague, and even my synopsis of the story is pretty vague. I obviously don't want to give too much away. Even though this book did have some really difficult topics, it's a really amazing book. I loved it. I think it's like one of Colleen Hoover's more underrated books. With a lot of her books, I feel like I could reread them one day eventually. I'd have to be like prepared for the heartbreak again. But this one, I don't think I could ever reread it. It was just way too heartbreaking. I did really love it and enjoy it, and I did think it was an amazing book, but it was just like way too heartbreaking for me to ever read it again. But I do still recommend it. The next book is Ugly Love by Colleen Hoover, and this book basically follows this girl named Tate who moves in with her brother, and there's this guy named Miles who lives across the hall, and he is also friends with Tate's brother. And basically there's kind of this attraction between the two of them, and they eventually act on that, and they kind of make this whole like friends with benefits deal. And Miles tells Tate that that's pretty much all he can give her. He can never actually like, you know, love her and give her like a real relationship, and Tate is pretty much fine with that. She agrees with it. So he comes up with 2 rules for her, which are that she can never ask about his past and she can't expect a future. So obviously they come to this agreement. They are friends with benefits for a while, but then of course feelings start to develop, especially on Tate's end, and it gets to a point where she's like really starting to fall for Miles, but he isn't like, you know, letting himself fall for her, and she doesn't really understand why. And it does switch from the then and now, and in the then chapters it's like in Miles's perspective. So we slowly kind of start to learn about his past, and we find out something that happened in his past that really like broke him, and that's pretty much the reason why he never wants to be in love again. And so the thing about this book that was super heartbreaking was Miles's story in the past, but I did really love this book a lot. It was really great. I really loved like the ending of it, just like the way it kind of wraps up, and I just really loved the message of it too. This is probably my second favorite book by Colleen Hoover, and I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. So the next book is All Your Perfects, also by Colleen Hoover, and this book basically follows this couple, Quinn and Graham. They met because Quinn's fiance was cheating on her with Graham's girlfriend. So they both obviously dumped their significant others, and that's kind of like where they initially met. And then we fast forward to like the present day, and we see that it's 7 years later and they're married now. And basically their marriage is kind of falling apart at this point. And so we just kind of switch between the then and now, seeing like their relationship from the beginning, like how they met, how they eventually fell in love, and then it switches like to the now chapters and just seeing kind of like all of the issues that they're having in their marriage now. And this book was incredibly heartbreaking just because of like the topics that it does deal with. But on top of that, it was just so sad to like see kind of how their marriage fell apart, just because you do get those then chapters and you just see like how in love they were and how like perfect they were for each other, and then you just see like in the present day how different they are now, and the fact that their marriage has gotten to the point that it's at now, like you wouldn't have expected it based on the way they were in like the then chapters. But this book, I just love it so much. It's one of my favorites. It's so good. There are letters in this book. I know some people really love books where like one of the main characters will write like handwritten letters to the other character, so that is something that's in this book, and those letters, I just love them so much. They completely like broke my heart, but also like healed it at the same time, and I just love this book. It's amazing. This one is one that I definitely want to reread at some point, and it was one that before I read it, I really didn't have high hopes for it, just because I didn't think I would care that much for the storyline, like about a married couple dealing with like problems in their marriage. But it was an amazing book. I loved it so much. The last book I'm going to recommend is my absolute favorite book of all time, and that is It Ends With Us. This is like my go-to book recommendation. If you read any of these books, read this one. So this book basically follows this girl named Lily, and she meets this guy named Ryle. He's just very charming and she falls for him, but then at the same time she finds these like old notebooks. They're like her old diaries where she used to just write obviously about her life, and she's like reading through them, and we find out kind of a lot about like her past. But she did meet this boy named Atlas when she was, I think, 15, and the two of them became really good friends, and eventually they fell in love with each other. But they did lose contact, so she hasn't seen him in years, but she is just kind of like reading through these notebooks, and we get to learn kind of about her past, but at the same time she is falling for Ryle. And this one, again, I don't want to get too much into it because I don't want to give anything away. I think you should definitely check trigger warnings for this book if you need to, because it does deal with some very serious topics. But I went in not really knowing much about it, and I think it made the book a lot better just because I didn't expect what happened, and I feel like it made the story a lot more impactful for me. But this book is the one that stuck with me the most out of all of these books. Like I said, it's my favorite book of all time, and I think why I love it so much is just because of like how impactful it was and how much it affected me and how much I literally still think about it. Like to this day, it's been months and I think about it like all the time, like almost every day. So if you haven't read this book, like please read it. It's amazing. It's like one of those books that I just think everyone should read. So those are all the book recs that I have for this video. Like I said, these are all amazing books that I still think about and would highly recommend, but of course don't forget to check any trigger warnings for these. But that's it for this video. Please subscribe if you want to see more, and thank you so much for watching.